Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of Black History Month, including where it came from and how it has evolved over the last 100 years or so. My guest for this conversation is a good friend to this radio program, Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of dozens of books. His latest is called The Bittersweet Science. He joins me over Zoom. Professor Horne, always great to see you, sir. Thank you for taking time to join me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Black History Month oftentimes is, in the research that I had done for our conversation, seems to be credited back to the 1926, and they talk about a man by the name of Carter G. Woodson, who in 1926 initiated the first celebration of, at the time, was called Negro History Week. What's important about what happens in 1926?
Well, the prelude to 1926 and Black History Month, what is now called Black History Month, has to be seen through the lens of the founder, Carter G. Woodson, a historian with roots in what is now West Virginia, a founder of probably the most substantial Black Studies organization today, now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, once known as the Associations for the Study of Negro Life and History, founded in 1915. The backstory for Negro History Month is the atrocious conditions Black people were subjected to. I mean, if you were to flip through a library catalog, you would find such titles as The Negro as Beast. You would also, if you thumb through a history book, even history books today, you could read rather devastating stories about how Black people during slavery were being bred like animals because we were seen as a offshoot of cattle and mules and horses. We were subjected to lynchings, that is to say, executed without due process of law by enraged mobs. Movies such as Birth of a Nation, which comes out more than a century ago, which is a love letter to the Ku Klux Klan, featuring rather ill-designed Black characters, is actually exhibited in the White House, where reputedly then U.S. President Woodrow Wilson praised it. Of course, he had roots in Virginia, although he had been governor of New Jersey, and had said it was like history written in lightning. And then, of course, shortly after, perhaps a decade or more after Negro History Month commences, you have Gone with the Wind, a kind of Moonlight Magnolias version of slavery with rather, once again, ill-designed Black characters. So this is the context in which Carter G. Woodson, not only Carter G. Woodson, but many of his comrades decide that there needs to be this mass education project with regard to educating people in the United States about Black history. And of course, what happens subsequently is that it starts out as a week, it spreads to a month. By the 1970s, it gets a kind of official or primatur from the US itself. It's marked in Canada, it's marked across the Atlantic to a certain degree, at least in the Anglosphere across the Atlantic. And I think that many younger Black people at a certain point, a la a certain unease with the Martin Luther King holiday, they felt that Black History Month was being co-opted. And so then that led to Black August, which stresses the Haitian Revolution, which jumps off August 1791, the Watts Uprising in Los Angeles, August 1965, the Nat Turner Slave Revolt, August 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. And Black August, of course, does not have the currency, at least thus far, of Black History Month, but my opinion is let 1,000 flowers bloom. Why not have multiple occasions to mark and celebrate and recognize Black history? Because it's a protean field, there's much that can be learned. There's much can be learned in many different branches. For example, Black History Month implicates class struggle because we're mostly talking about an enslaved Black population that is a class of oppressed workers. And so when you talk about Nat Turner or you talk about slave revolts, you're talking about class struggle. You're talking about women's rights. You're talking about BLTGQ rights vis-a-vis Audre Lorde or James Baldwin. So it's an all-encompassing kind of event that deserves even more emphasis than it has received thus far.
My understanding is Carter Woodson's idea of having, again, what he called the Negro History Week wasn't necessarily to spend a week to talk about Black history, that instead Black history should be taught all year round, and that this week should be used to see what students and others had actually learned about Black history over the year.
And I think that's a point worth reviving. I should also say as well, with regard to the origin story of Black History Month, I think it also comes from the fact, as we well know, when we Africans and our ancestors were kidnapped from Africa, there was a concerted effort to detach us from our roots. And I think as a result, there is a passionate interest in Black history in the Black American community. And I think that oftentimes it benefits the larger US community. I mean, for example, if you look at some of the contributions that Black historians have made, I'm thinking of, for example, Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, a founder of the Pan-Africanist movement. When it's published in 1935, there is a kind of gone with the wind, birth of a nation view of not only Reconstruction, but slavery itself. But with the publication of this, 800-page tome, you begin to see a shift in the discourse with regard to seeing slavery as the cause of the Civil War, with regard to this ongoing attempt to undermine and discredit the Confederates who sought to overthrow the United States government so that they could perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore, in terms of crediting the contributions of Reconstruction, which were actually tentative steps towards social democracy in this country, which has yet to flourish, to put it mildly. That is to say that after the enslaved were freed, circa 1865, you had the establishment of the so-called Freedmen's Bureau, which, amongst other things, were trying to tend to the health needs of the formerly enslaved. And in fact, not only the formerly enslaved, but all in the Deep South. Public schools, to a large extent, are a product of the Reconstruction period. Spending on roads and infrastructure in the South in particular, to a certain extent, is a product of Reconstruction. So we still see this trend today, because what's happening today is that once again, you have an efflorescence of Black creators seeking to revision the history of this country. That's the import of the New York Times bestseller, The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, where rather audaciously she puts forth the idea that slavery had quite a bit to do with the revolt against British rule in 1776, which established the United States of America, which is quite explanatory in terms of shedding light upon why Black people tend to be treated so atrociously even after the abolition of slavery, the erosion of Jim Crow, and perhaps why there is a backlash today, because the impulse, the impetus for the creation of the country, and to a certain degree, was to keep Black people down. But it's not just Nicole Hannah-Jones. I mean, if you look at the rather marvelous documentary by the Haitian filmmaker Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, a sweeping analysis, castigation of settler colonialism stretching back centuries. One of the talking heads in this wonderful documentary, which played on HBO Max, by the way, was your own Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, that is to say, a professor with roots in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then, speaking of the San Francisco Bay Area, if you look at the spoof of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza Hamilton, penned by Oakland's Ishmael Reed, the paramount Black intellectual, you see once again an attempt to revisit the creation myth, what I call the creation myth of the United States of America. Now, these are efforts that have been launched, although I dare say that they will follow in the footsteps of Black Reconstruction. When it was first published in 1935, it was a phenomenon to a certain degree in the Black community, but today it's accepted widely as the interpretation of Reconstruction and to a certain degree slavery. And I think that these works that I've just cited eventually will be treading a similar path.
That's really interesting to think about, because you're right. W.B. Du Bois in the 1930s changes the narrative of what happened to Reconstruction, to where now it is the story of Reconstruction. And you see parallels to that with such things as the 1619 Project and other things that you mentioned. I do want to give credit where credit is due. The 1619 Project makes an argument that slavery was a significant reason for the American Revolutionary War in 1776. You, sir, wrote the CounterRevolution of 1776, 10 years ago, making that very same argument.
Yes, and since then I've written books about the origins of settler colonialism in North America, going back to the 16th century, in the book The Dawning of the Apocalypse, and the 17th century, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. But I should also mention others who are walking along the same path. Once again, the San Francisco Bay Area, what a coincidence, I haven't thought about why this is the case. The former UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz professor, now deceased, Tyler Stovall, his book White Freedom, published last year, is quite a breakthrough in terms of its revisiting not only of 1776, but the French Revolution as well. And one of the points you can take away from this, at least that I take away from this explosion of creativity, and I would also mention a documentary film by the woman filmmaker, Euro-American woman filmmaker, Fran Causey, The Long Shadow, which is I would group it with Raoul Peck's film, Exterminate All the Brutes, in terms of being explanatory. But one of the points that I think some in your audience might find troubling is that we've known for a long time, historians have known for a long time, that the war and the revolt against British rule, that more Black people sided with London than sided with George Washington and company, which is understandable because what's interesting is that many of our Marxist friends, they have the position that class struggle is the North Star, class struggle is the lodestar. And as aforementioned, Black people are not only a, quote, race, unquote, it's an oppressed, exploited working class, unpaid class. And according to a certain Marxist theory, you would think that they would have nothing in common with their oppressors and they would not engage in class collaboration and side with their oppressors in order, as happened subsequently, for their chains to be tightened and for the United States to surge into the lead of the African slave trade, which it does after the United States is founded and, of course, becomes the leading purveyor of enslaved Africans to Cuba by the 1790s, to Brazil by the 1840s. But yet, many of the Marxist historians have not looked at Black people through the lens of class struggle. They've looked at them through the lens, actually, although they don't say it, through class collaboration. Now, I guess it's because they want to keep us all on the same page. For example, because I guess they feel that that's important for struggle today, for everybody to sort of be rowing in the same direction. The problem is right now is that you have serious discussion in this country about fascism arising. You have generals writing in the Washington Post about coups. You have a leading Republican Party, the Republican Party, at their last leadership meeting, saying that the insurrection on January 6th was legitimate. So obviously there's something awry, and that you would think that it would lead to a reconsideration, a reformulation, but alas, it has not taken place, at least not to this point.
The origins of Black History Month, again in the 1920s, is the 1920s significant in American life and the origins of what was called Negro History Week? And I guess I'm thinking of Alain Locke, who I think coined the term the New Negro. We have the Harlem Renaissance occurring at this time. Is this significant for the creation of Negro History Week?
I think so. And I think also to turn the coin over, as you can go on YouTube and validate this, there are marches of tens of thousands of Klan members in Washington, D.C. In the 1920s. As you know, the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan emerges around the same time as Birth of a Nation, which is not a coincidence, that is to say, circa 1915. And they wield significant political influence. It's not some sort of fringe outfit. They wield influence in state houses in Oregon and Indiana, amongst other sites. And I think that with their lynching practices, not only their lynching practices of Black people, but keep in mind as well that the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan also was heavily anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, for example. And I think that when Carter G. Woodson takes the lead, and his organization, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, take the lead, it's able to attract a broader adherents beyond the Black community, because many in these other affected communities that I've just referenced could see that if you're not able to squash this anti-Black virus, it's highly transmissible and can spread like wildfire. And ultimately, we also know that it's the 1920s where you have the surge and the resurgence of a fascist movement with the March on Rome by Benito Mussolini, kicking that off, the rise of Hitlerism at the same time. And so this is a very propitious moment to begin this mass education campaign that is Black History Month, to push back against this highly transmissible virus through the vaccine, if you like, of Negro History Week and Negro History Month.
There's a culture war going on here. I mean, this is the same decade, I believe, that W.E.B. Du Bois writes The Soul of Black Folk.
Well, I think it comes out a little earlier, but certainly it's still prominent and prevalent during that time. And keep in mind as well that this is the time, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, about the racist massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you have Black people massacred en masse. This is the time following World War I's conclusion, 1918, where you have Black soldiers who shed blood on the battlefields of Europe and then come back home expecting some sort of lurch towards democracy, and instead oftentimes are attacked in their uniforms. This helps to give rise to a certain kind of militancy as well. And interestingly enough, circa 1918, 1919, you have one of these pogroms attempted in Washington, D.C. And interestingly enough, Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History, is caught up in the fracas. He barely escapes without being massacred. And what's interesting about that particular Washington episode is that one of the reasons that it did not spread further is that for various reasons, Black people had armed and they were able to fight back. And I think that militant spirit of fight back was also embedded in the early stages of Negro History Week and Negro History Month.
Carter G. Woodson also warned about Negro History Week being co-opted, warned who other educational facilities would have come teach it. I think he said he warned them, don't have somebody come in to talk about Negro History Week who knows less than the actual audience. And it's interesting, when we think about what has happened and how some people think that Black History Month has been co-opted in more modern times.
Well, as I said, I think that's what's given rise to Black August, because of, I think that the folks, and they're particularly people in California, by the way, who helped to develop Black August, I think that they were trying to establish a certain militancy with regard to marking Black history. Once again, referencing not only Nat Turner and his slave revolt, the Haitian Revolution, the Watts Uprising, but also the prison unrest in San Quentin, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, which gives rise to George Jackson and his being slain during that same period, and his younger brother, Jonathan Jackson, who tries to have an impact on that particular case of his older brother and is accused of taking judges and others hostage, but then leads to his being killed, the judge and others of being wounded or killed. And so I think that there has been this reaction to what some might call the Santa Clausification of Black history, because as we know, the corporations in this country, they're quite sly and devious. And oftentimes they see Black History Month as another opportunity for marketing. And obviously this is a direct turnoff to many of our younger people, and actually many of our older people too, for that matter. But like anything else in this country, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for the soul of Black History Month. And as for myself, as a Black historian, I salute Black History Month in February, and I salute Black August, because I've written about the Haitian Revolution, I've written about Nat Turner, I've written about the Watts Uprising of 1965, and I'm going to do a book that implicates the Jackson brothers, not George and Jonathan, in other words. So I think that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom.
The Juneteenth has been celebrated in Texas for a long time, but in more recent years has become a national holiday. Do you see the celebration of Juneteenth in that same vein?
Well, yeah, Juneteenth is just taking off. I just reread Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, because I'm doing a couple of long takes on it, reviews and essays, et cetera. And I noticed that he didn't mention Juneteenth, or if he did, it's not prominent, although I read the book carefully. And I think that that's a reflection of the fact that Juneteenth is kind of a latecomer nationally. Certainly, it was marked June 19th, 1865, when it is said that this Union general, this Lincoln government general, or U.S. government general, I should say, comes into Galveston, Texas, and tells the Negroes, the formerly enslaved, that they're free. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, because what happens is that the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, penned by Abraham Lincoln, did not necessarily apply, shall we say, in areas where he did not have jurisdiction. Texas was a Confederate state. And in any case, even after June 19th, 1865, there are credible cases of unpaid labor, de facto slavery taking place in the state of Texas. In fact, the plan of the Confederates post the surrender at Appomattox in Virginia by Robert E. Lee was to move en masse to Texas, which you may recall had seceded from Mexico in 1836 because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery. The French had taken over Mexico. That is the origins of what is now the Chicano holiday, Cinco de Mayo. And the idea was to align with the French in Mexico to continue to wage war in the United States and to continue slavery. And that did not end, coincidentally enough, until June 19th, 1867, when the French puppet leader in Mexico, Maximilian, is executed. And so I'd like to talk about the long Juneteenth, from June 19th, 1865 to June 19th, 1867, with the latter actually being a more concrete step towards real emancipation. And of course, my book that deals with this subject will be out by the end of the year.
This is Letters and Politics, and today we are in conversation about the history of Black History Month. Our guest is Gerald Horne. He is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of a number of books. His latest is called The Bittersweet Science. Is February Black History Month because February is the birthdays of both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln?
That's correct, and other leading figures as well. As a matter of fact, as I was thinking about our talk today, I was thinking, as I said a moment ago, about offshoots of Black History Month, Black August, and I was thinking about a BLTGQ offshoot. And so I looked up the birthday of Audre Lorde, the Black lesbian warrior writer. It's February. And then I looked up the birthday of James Baldwin, the gay essayist, novelist, playwright, etc. It's August. So I was thinking that maybe it would be like Lorraine Hansberry, the queer Black playwright who wrote Raising the Sun, which is May. And then I was thinking, well, maybe we'll be able to have 12 months a year built around different aspects, around labor history, labor leaders, women's leaders, artists, etc. But yes, as you suggested, the original Negro history month, as devised by Carter G. Woodson, has a lot to do with the birthdays of figures like Lincoln and Douglass.
With the civil rights movement, is that where we get this shift from Negro History Week to Black History Month?
Well, as you know, with the erosion of Jim Crow in the 1950s and 1960s, you have a reconsideration of verbiage and nomenclature, and there's a certain discrediting of the term Negro, and it's supplanted by terms such as Black, such as Afro-American, such as African-American, and Negro History Month then traverses that same path. Shedding the term Negro into Black, and now some people call it African American History Month or Africana History Month.
But it is here, like in the 60s, where we get this shift from a week to a month.
Oh, I see. Well, I think it's even before that, from a week to a month, but I would have to check that.
Yeah. And then it's in the 1970s when President Gerald Ford recognizes Black History Month nationally. And I guess this, on one hand, it's a good thing, right? I mean, busting into the mainstream means you busted into the mainstream, but it also means, the other hand, what we've sort of already dabbled in, the co-optation of Black History Month.
Well, sure. And Gerald Ford is under siege. You may recall that he succeeds the disgraced Richard M. Nixon as president. He was in hot water politically. Recalled it was Gerald Ford who collaborated with apartheid South Africa circa 1975 in a CIA venture to try to establish a neo-apartheid regime in the Southwest African nation of Angola. So he was in a kind of bad odor with the Black community, and his moving to recognize Black History Month to a certain extent was an attempt to lift his sagging poll numbers in the Black community, although I don't think it worked.
Yeah. And then finally, on Black History Month, some people will complain that, of course, Black History Month comes on the shortest month of the year, and that figures. And again, complaints about co-opting Black History Month, et cetera, et cetera. But as you indicated earlier, for you personally, as a historian yourself, you are for, may there be something, let as many flowers as possible bloom.
Oh, clearly. And of course, for those who are concerned about 28 days in February, the 31, in August, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that this Black History Month, as suggested, by these works that I've mentioned, and they're worth repeating, the works of Tyler Stovall, Ishmael Reed, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Fran Causey, Raoul Peck. It's difficult to imagine these substantial works of history and film and art taking place absent this mass movement around Black History Month. And as suggested, I think that ultimately these works will become the new consensus, just like W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in 1935. At first, it was just recognized in the Black community. Now it's the new consensus. And I dare say that this will happen to these latter works I just referenced.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. Gerald Horne, we also wanted to bring you on because you're also an observer of geopolitics, what's happening in the world. And of course, many of us, and I know you are as well, paying a great deal of attention of what's happening in Eastern Europe, particularly the situation at the Russian-Ukrainian border, the situation between Ukraine, Russia, NATO, the United States. As an internationalist yourself, how do you observe what's happening there?
Well, first of all, let me build a bridge to the previous subject, because at one time, particularly during the heyday of W.E.B. Du Bois, you had Black commentators who were quite immersed in international affairs. But with what I call the compromise of 1954, that is to say, the erosion of Jim Crow, a part of the trade-off was that Black people who historically had relied upon the international community for aid and comfort and for support, moved away from that and kind of domesticated the struggle, detached our struggle from Pan-Africanism, African liberation movements, Caribbean liberation movement. I think that's one of the reasons why we're in such trouble today. But having said that, I've tried to maintain that older tradition. And certainly with regard to Ukraine, it seems to me at least that it involves arms, because if Ukraine joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, like Montenegro and North Macedonia and the other formerly socialist countries or regions that have doubled the size of NATO since 1997, per the US-dominated NATO concept of interoperability, they have to start buying US weapons. And so I dare say, if you look at the stock price of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the former home of Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, you probably see their stock going up in anticipation. Although with this latest Macron venture to Moscow and Kyiv, perhaps they're heading back down. Secondly, it's about natural gas. As we know, Mr. Biden entertained the Emir of Qatar, a national gas producer, in the Oval Office just a few days ago. And Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, has already suggested that Texas natural gas could be a substitute for Russian natural gas, assuming that there is an invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And then there was an interesting piece in the Financial Times of London just a few days ago. In the aftermath of President Zelensky of Ukraine reprimanding the White House for all this war talk, the Financial Times article mentioned that the war talk was having a depressing impact on Ukrainian stocks, allowing U.S. hedge funds to go into the Ukrainian market and scoop up these stocks. So this is some of the backstory of this Ukraine crisis that I would like to see. But also, I should also mention that in thinking more deeply about this crisis, it reminds me of an article I wrote in 1997 entitled Who Lost the Cold War? African and African Americans. And I was saying that because this international pressure of the Cold War had caused the U.S. ruling class to move away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow and U.S. apartheid so as to better appeal to countries emerging to independence in the Caribbean and Africa. And that with the imminent collapse and the ongoing collapse of that bloc in Eastern Europe, it left Black Americans without that many global allies, which, of course, in the 19th century, we relied heavily upon the alliance with London, for example, which I've also written about. And so I think it's also fair to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the socialist camp might have been a catastrophic victory for U.S. imperialism. It's a victory, no doubt. It leads to unipolarity. It leads, although it does lead to the United States having free reign to get bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and elsewhere. But at the same time, in order to effectuate that victory, speaking of Afghanistan, there has to be an alliance with religious zealotry in Afghanistan from late 1970s, if you believe Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Carter National Security Advisor, up until the evacuation of Soviet troops and about a decade later. Most spectacularly, it leads to the rise of the People's Republic of China, because in the 1970s, as we all know, Nixon and Kissinger effectuate an entente with China on an anti-Soviet basis, leading to massive foreign direct investment in China and the creation of this juggernaut that bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust. And then I think in terms of the Soviet Union, it leads to a collapse of that country, which also means fewer subsidies going to Moldova and to Turkestan and to Georgia, allowing Moscow to husband its resources. And once again, in the San Francisco Bay Area, Stanford's own scholar, Catherine Stoner, wrote this book, Russian Resurrected. You probably should interview her, about how there's been an underestimation of the economic strength of Russia, which I think has contributed to this crisis. It's a kind of agricultural superpower. It's developed hypersonic missiles, which is unclear if that is in the U.S. arsenal. It has foreign reserves that are creeping towards $1 trillion. And then most importantly, it's led to this alliance with China, which is strategically important. And I've noticed that Robin Wright in the New Yorker has a piece recently, longtime foreign correspondent, where she intimates, or at least this is the inference that I drew, that this could lead to a major shift in the global correlation of forces. It could also lead to a split in NATO. I mean, that's the import of Mr. Macron's trips to Moscow and Kyiv, because, of course, Mr. Macron already has spoken of NATO as being brain dead. Germany tends to tail after France for various reasons. France, if you go back to Charles de Gaulle, the leader in the 1960s, has been inching away from U.S. hegemony, and now embedded in Macron's concept of strategic autonomy, which it seems to me that's where the Minsk and Normandy Accords are headed towards. And so I'm trying to figure out how this is going to be spun as a victory for Washington if these present trends continue. But there's a deeper question as well. And that is, if you look at your map, you'll see that most of Europe is Russian territory. Russia's population, even today, is about twice as large as the number 2 country, the Federal Republic of Germany. And so before 1917 and after 1917, that is to say the Russian Revolution being that demarcation point, you've had the North Atlantic powers seeking to marginalize Russia, and that's continuing to this very day, and I think it's led to this current crisis. But trying to marginalize Russia in Europe, particularly when Europe is so dependent upon energy resources from Russia, is trying to marginalize China and Asia, or the United States and North America, or Brazil and South America. It's a very heavy lift. And I think that it's also led to spectacular misjudgments by the North Atlantic powers. I mentioned religious zealotry and the deal with China from the US side. Well, go back to 1905, when Britain basically finances the Japanese attack on Russia, which of course is victorious. It's a turning point in world history. It also leads, I think it's fair to say, to the Russian Revolution of 1917, and also to Japan devastating the British Empire by 1941, the knockout blow administered to British forces in Hong Kong and Singapore. So, amongst other sites. So I think that we really need a deeper analysis of what's going on in Eastern Europe. I haven't seen it displayed, certainly not in the mainstream press, which I don't really expect. But even in the left organs, I haven't seen any sort of new analysis or renewed analysis that I think this crisis so well deserves.
Why the continuing marginalization of Russia in Europe? I understand 1917, the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks. I know other powers were scared of revolution at that time. I understand the Soviet Union, but it's a very different regime that we have in power in Russia now with Putin.
Well, see, I think the dynamic is this. This is both pre-1917 and post-1917. Pre-1917, the Western European nations are fattening themselves on the plunder from the Americas and the plunder from the African slave trade, Britain and France in the first instance. But what's happening with regard to Russia is that it's moving eastward. Vladivostok, its window on the Pacific, is established in 1860, basically at the expense of China, by the way. And as you know, there is a lot of muttering right now in Washington about how to exploit these differences between Russia and China. But what I think also is the case is that, number one, not only did Britain seek to undermine Russia with the war via Japan in 1905, of course, there's the Crimean War in the 1850s, where Britain and France, with the sick man of Europe, speaking of Ottoman Turkey, once again gang up on Russia. But Russia strikes back because they're trying to foil their European neighbors. For example, there's a lot of celebration in the Black community, to go back to our first topic, about the Italian or Abyssinian defeat of the Italian invaders in the 1890s. Well, one of the reasons that the Italians are defeated is because the Abyssinians are armed to the teeth by Russia. Likewise, during the U.S. Civil War, we all know how the lords of the lash, the textile manufacturers, are seeking to have an entente with the Confederate States of America. We already talked about France seizing Mexico to work with the Confederate States of America. Well, actually, Russia was one of the few European powers that the United States could rely upon. And of course, Haiti was their other ally in terms of the Caribbean. And then that leads to a kind of Washington-Moscow spring, where Moscow basically, or I should say Russia, basically gifts what they didn't necessarily own, which is Alaska, to the United States by 1867 for a song. I think it was about $6 million, which is peanuts or kopecks, which of course has now become the 49th state, a source of energy and a source of politics too, political strength in the United States of America. And so I think that all of this contestation between the North Atlantic powers and Russia, in some ways, is not only a continuation of 1917, but it precedes 1917, because in some ways, in terms of Africa in particular, Russia or the Soviet Union continued this policy.
Yeah.
We know that with regard to the liberation of Southern Africa could not have happened without the arming of military wings in Angola, Namibia, South Africa, et cetera, by Moscow.
Could you see a return to that? Putin is oftentimes described as a nationalist, a strong nationalist, that in anything but a communist.
Oh, sure. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting. I hope people are following this. You have RT America and RT from Moscow in the United States, and then you have Sputnik, a radio station. And what's interesting is that Sputnik is like Pacifica. It appeals to the left. And if you watch RT lately, it's really tracking Fox News. I mean, some really vicious attacks on Black Lives Matter, for example, really swallowing the bait with regard to attacks on critical race theory and the kind of nonsense that Governor Youngkin.
They've also had far left folks on there as well. I mean, I know Chris Hedges has a show, but Chris Hedges has a show, and
of course, I appear on that too. But what I'm saying is that the difference is that pre-1991, you would not have seen any sort of media arm coming out of Moscow playing footsies with these right-wing forces. And so I think that actually, at the end of the day, it probably gives Moscow more strength. I mean, reference the criticisms of the Ukrainian escapade by Pat Buchanan, Tucker Carlson, Josh Hawley, et cetera. So in some ways, you not only have fortress Russia economically, but it has also been able to wield influence in the right wing, whereas the Soviet Union only had influence on the left wing, and really not that much at that, because I think one of the takeaways from my point of view from the Cold War is I recall that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the filmmaker Michael Moore said, one superpower down, one to go. The whole idea on the left was that after this supposed albatross of Soviet-oriented socialism disappeared, that the left would flower. But that hasn't happened. I mean, it hasn't happened in the United States. It hasn't happened in France, where the left has shriveled. It hasn't happened in Italy, where you've had the rise of the Five Star Movement. It hasn't happened in India, where the Congress Party has basically been marginalized, and you have serious talk about a genocide against Muslims. And so I think that there was a basic sort of miscalculation by many of our friends on the left that they haven't gone back to revisit, which of course is not shocking or surprising.
It is striking to me when you say all of that, with my own observation of cable television news, and I don't see everything, but at least from what I have seen, Tucker Carlson has been the strongest anti-war voice when it comes to what's happening with Ukraine and Russia.
Well, of course, he's quite close to Viktor Orban in Hungary. Mike Pence, of course, is close to Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is the right-wing populist leader in Budapest, who, by the way, was in Moscow just about a week ago, where he expressed sympathy for Moscow's position vis-a-vis Ukraine. And so this is a very complicated political situation. And one of the takeaways, at least for me, is this op-ed by Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal recently, where he said that the current moment mandates that U.S. escalate military spending. Now, the Pentagon just passed the spending bill that, or at least Congress has passed a bill for the Pentagon that actually gave the Pentagon more than Mr. Biden demanded. So we're entering very dangerous waters, and I'm not sure if Washington is going to have an answer for this emerging Beijing-Moscow alliance. Although one of the points that your listeners should pay attention to, Mr. Biden is headed to Asia this year. It would not surprise me at all if he visited Vietnam. Of course, that upends the logic of Vietnam War about monolithic communism, et cetera, although we know that China proved its mettle to Washington by waging war against Vietnam after the United States was pushed out in 1975. It would not surprise me if he visited India during the height of the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. China waged war against Nehru's India. India is still the closest non-communist or closest Asian ally of Moscow. And that was the case even more so during the Cold War. And that was seen as a feather in China's cap, that it seized this opportunity to weaken an ally of Washington, an ally of Moscow. So going forward, international politics is going to be more complicated, not as clear cut as during the Cold War, but perhaps more interesting.
Well, that was my next and final question is, do you see us slipping back into a Cold War setting, a Cold War position? I guess one significant difference is one side may not necessarily be firmly on the left.
Well, I think we are headed in that direction. As a matter of fact, I think that we should take this opportunity on Letters in Politics to enunciate the launching of Cold War II. That it was formally ratified on February 4th, 2022, at the onset of the Beijing Olympics, where you had this communique from Presidents Xi and Putin saying that their relationship is without limits, their words, not mine, That was the 37th or 38th time that they've met in recent years. As a matter of fact, they're meeting so often that people are beginning to talk. So I think that it is fair to say that we are now in a Cold War mode. And where this ends, well, let's hope that it does not end as some press organs overheated on this side of the Atlantic have suggested with a nuclear exchange.
Do you see any element of this like you did in the 20th century in the Soviet Union? And as you mentioned, the Soviet Union backing with arms and resources many liberation movements in Africa and South America as well. Do you see any kind of entity like that in this dynamic, or is that missing this time?
It's hard to say. I know, speaking personally, I've been appearing on Press TV out of Iran lately, usually in the aftermath of police killings of Black people, which are all too frequent. And I've oftentimes suggested, and it seems to resonate, that our Iranian friends should speak out in international fora on behalf of Black people. And as I said, I appear quite frequently on Sputnik Radio and RT, I should say as well, about the same subject. And not as much on Chinese media for whatever reason. But I do think that, it takes more than a few isolated voices. I mean, really, ultimately, what it will take is the NAACP weighing in. And since
that would be interesting. It's politically speaking, on international affairs. I mean, you're talking about sort of this break that happens in 1954 with civil rights and internationalism. I mean, wasn't the NAACP? You'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my recollection was the NAACP was a part of this dynamic of focusing just domestically.
Absolutely. And they threw W.E.B. Du Bois overboard. They attacked Paul Robeson. As a matter of fact, I was on a radio show just the other day where I suggested that his upcoming convention this summer, that the NAACP invite surviving members of the Robeson family to the convention to apologize formally. Next year marks the 125th anniversary of Paul Robeson's birth. For those who may not be familiar, he's the great actor, activist, socialist, political crusader who ran afoul of the U.S. authorities and was marginalized and to a certain degree isolated in the 1950s. And the NAACP participated in that. That was part of the trade-off. That was part of the deal, where in return for these anti-Jim Crow concessions, they would pull in their horns with regard to international affairs. But obviously that bargain has expired. The Supreme Court, in which they were to rely, is now firmly in the hands of the right. That will be the case for some time to come. They were banking on the liberal wing of the U.S. ruling class remaining in the driver's seat. I'm not even sure if the liberal wing of the U.S. ruling class can save itself, let alone Black people, particularly in light of all this talk about fascism and coups and January 6th being legitimate, et cetera. So obviously it's time for a new deal, a new bargain, new thinking, but whether or not that will happen is another story.
Gerald Horne has been our guest. Again, Gerald Horne is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of a number of books. His latest is called The Bittersweet Science. Professor Horne, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.